Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Debian. Today's episode is really about why Debian matters far beyond its own user base. It's a Linux distribution. Yes, but it's also a long-running experiment in democratic open-source governance, a machine built for stability, and the foundation under a huge slice of the wider Linux world. And because it's been around long enough to matter, it's also picked up some very real arguments, mistakes, and course corrections along the way. One of the most distinctive things about Debian is that it isn't steered by a single company with a CEO at the top making the final call. It runs through a constitution, a social contract, and the Debian Free Software Guidelines, with developers electing a project leader every year and keeping the power to overturn leadership decisions through general resolutions. They even use the Schulze voting method, which is the kind of detail that tells you Debian takes process seriously, in a way that's almost charmingly intense. The legal and financial side lives with Software in the Public Interest, a nonprofit founded by Debian members back in 1997. That setup lets Debian handle assets, trademarks, and donations without turning the project itself into a commercial entity, which helps keep it independent from any one sponsor. In practice, this all works through a big web of trust. About 1,000 active developers plus many other contributors coordinating through mailing lists, bug trackers, conferences, and delegated teams. You don't have to become an official Debian developer to help, but formal membership is vetted pretty carefully for identity, motivation, technical ability, and whether someone actually understands the project's philosophy. Debian has never really been in the business of shipping the newest shiny thing as fast as possible. Its center of gravity is stability and long-term support, which is why the stable branch is so important to people running servers, labs, schools, or machines. They simply need to trust. That doesn't mean it's frozen in amber. Stable still gets major security and usability fixes, and backports give people a path to newer applications, without asking them to throw out the stable base underneath. The pipeline is part of the story here. Packages land in unstable first, then move to testing only after waiting periods and checks for dependencies and release critical bugs. Testing sounds reassuring, but it's really a moving beta, not just a slightly fresher stable release. Then after a freeze, testing eventually becomes the next stable. Since 2009, Debian has used time-based freezes on roughly a 2-year rhythm, but not rigid release dates. So there's some planning predictability while still leaving room to say, no, this isn't ready yet. Fix the serious bugs first. Each release can end up with around 5 years of security support through the regular security team and the LTS effort, which is a big part of why Debian gets trusted in serious places. Debian's relationship to software freedom is one of its defining themes, and also one of its longest-running tensions. The Debian Free Software Guidelines sort packages into main, contrib, and non-free. Main is for software that meets the project's freedom standards, while contrib and non-free cover software or dependencies that don't fully qualify. What makes Debian interesting is that it has kept those non-free areas accessible, even though that has never been philosophically comfortable for everyone. Richard Stallman, the Free Software Foundation, and some Debian leaders have criticized that choice over the years. But in 2004, Debian developers voted to keep the non-free section, which told you pretty clearly that practical usability was going to stay in the picture. That same tension showed up again in 2022, when Debian decided the installer would include non-free firmware by default when hardware needs it. That was a pragmatic shift, but not exactly a surrender. The project kept its free software principles while acknowledging a pretty basic reality. If your modern machine can't boot properly without proprietary firmware, a pure stance can start feeling a lot like a locked door. Debian is not just a distro people install directly, it's also an upstream base for a huge family of other systems. DistroWatch counted 141 active Debian derivatives in 2025, which is a reminder that Debian's influence often shows up under somebody else's wallpaper. Bumdem is the obvious example, but so are Notepix, Tails, Linux Mint Debian Edition, and Dev1, which exists partly to avoid systemd. Bumdem's arrival in 2004 exposed a structural tension that still feels familiar. Its easier installer, 6-month release cycle, and shorter support model attracted users and contributors fast. But some Debian people worried that if downstream development started targeting Ubuntu first, Debian itself could lose momentum and the ecosystem could fragment. Even with that tension, Debian's footprint is enormous. It turns up on desktops and servers, of course, but also in Docker containers, cloud deep learning images, embedded devices, schools, government migrations, the Wikimedia Foundation, and even laptops on the International Space Station. That's a pretty good range for a project whose public image is often just COM package management. Because Debian is so decentralized, its disputes can get very fundamental. One famous example was Dunk Tank, an experiment that paid 2 release managers to help speed up the etch release. The backlash was sharp enough that some developers actually reduced their volunteer contributions because selective compensation clashed with Debian's norms about shared volunteer work. Then there was the 2014 decision by the technical committee to adopt systemd as the default init system. That fight led to resignations and eventually to Dev1, a Debian derivative built around opposition to systemd. It was messy, but it also showed something important about Debian structure. When consensus fails, the system can absorb dissent through procedure, and sometimes through a fork. Another memorable clash came from Mozilla trademarks. Because Debian patched Firefox, Thunderbird, and SeaMonkey without Mozilla's approval, and because the logos weren't compatible with Debian's guidelines, those apps were renamed Iceweasel, iStove, and Iceape. Only later, after Mozilla relicensed its logos and accepted Debian's patching practices, did the original names come back in Debian 9. Very Debian story, honestly. Half principle, half packaging, policy, all somehow consequential. Debian also carries one of the most sobering security stories in Linux history, the 2008 OpenSSL flaw. A developer removed what looked like uninitialized memory after Valgrind warnings, which sounds reasonable until you learn that OpenSSL had been relying on that behavior for randomness. The result was disastrous. Only 32,767 possible keys could be generated, affecting SSH, OpenVPN, DNSSEC certificates, and TLS sessions. And fixing it wasn't as simple as updating one package. Keys and certificates created with the broken code had to be found and regenerated, which turned a code bug into a long cleanup operation. The larger lesson was brutal but useful. A well-intentioned quality fix can become a security failure if hidden assumptions aren't understood. Since then, Debian has pushed harder on safer defaults and verification, including AppArmor by default in Debian 10, stronger secure boot support in Debian 11, persistent system journaling, and reproducible builds, so people can better verify that published packages match their source. One more thing that's easy to overlook. Debian's technical range is huge. It supports everything from AMD 64 and ARM variants to PowerPC, RISC-V, and IBM Z/ architecture, plus unofficial ports like GNU Hurd and various legacy systems. It can run on NAS boxes, single-board computers, routers, set-top boxes, and all kinds of specialized embedded hardware. It's also pretty frugal when it needs to be. The installer can work with about 170 megabytes of RAM on x86-64 in low memory mode, even if a more typical desktop install wants around 2 gigabytes of RAM and 10 gigabytes of storage. And then there's the software catalog, nearly 70,000 packages in stable, multiple desktop environments and Wayland compositors, 77 installer languages, and installation paths ranging from tiny network images to live USB setups. Debian has this rare combination of being both sprawling and methodical, which is maybe why it keeps showing up in places you wouldn't think to look. So if Debian can seem a little slow or a little process-heavy from the outside, that's partly because it's carrying a lot more than one operating system release. It's carrying a philosophy, a governance model, and a giant ecosystem that keeps branching in every direction. And somehow, with all the arguments and all the moving parts, it still mostly works, which might be the most impressive part of the whole thing. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.
Podkey.